We now invite Brother Jimmy to exhort us on the topic of trust.
Good morning, everybody. During the Adelaide Show Week, because my work is right in front of the showgrounds, they take us away for a 2-day conference. And during this time, there were some presenters and workshops that were done. And one of the presentations was done by an external consultant. I can't remember the topic name, but she did a presentation designed to get us to individually focus on our lives, and specifically what the most important things in our lives are. And one exercise that she actually did was get us to draw a circle and divide it into 8 segments. Then in each segment, we had to write down a main focus of our life. And we all had to try and come up with 8 pillars, 8 principles, 8 focuses of our life. And most people got around 5 or 6 and struggled to get 8. The first of my 8 that I put down there was faith, because as sisters and as brothers of Christ, I'm confident, this would be the first of your 8 also. It's a very important aspect of our life. And the second one of mine that I put was the word father, because being a good father to my 2 girls is an extremely important focus of my life. And I won't share the remaining 6. However, I highly recommend that you do this exercise yourself as well, as it really gets you to think about the 8 most important focuses of your life. And when you do it, maybe record the results on a piece of paper where you can refer to later. And, God willing, if we get older, as we get older, some of these 8 segments may change also. And during this session, the presenter also displayed an equation to us which really struck a chord with me. And I thought it was quite good, so I thought I would share it with you this morning. So the equation is this. It says that trust equals the sum of reliability, capability, intimacy, all divided by self-interest. So trust equals reliability plus capability plus intimacy, all divided by self-interest. And this equation is saying that trust is the product of these 3 things: reliability, capability, and intimacy. However, it's all divided by self-interest. That is, trust can be diminished by self-interest. And I think this equation, it really hit home to me because of those first 2 segments of my pie, faith and father. Both of these have a foundation in trust, don't they? For me to be a good father, I need to show to my children that I'm trustworthy so that they can trust in me. And the relationship I have with my children needs to be built on trust. And in a similar way, for me to have a strong faith, I need to trust in God and His Word. So this morning, what I thought that we could do is take a deeper look at this equation in relation to our trust in God and His Word, the Bible. And as we consider this, it's also worth considering how this applies to the trust that we have with each other also. And over the last week, the middle portion of our reading has been taken from Daniel. So what we'll do is that we'll take some of the events in his life as examples as we ponder this equation together. So the first of the 3 factors of trust is reliability. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines reliability as the quality of being able to be trusted or believed because of working or behaving well. In this definition, you can clearly see it links trust and reliability. And I think in our day and age, these 2 ideas probably come together most frequently when we think maybe about purchasing a car. When purchasing a car, one of the first considerations we probably have is the car's reliability. Is the car reliable? Is it going to break down? Can we trust it? And I was actually listening to a wilderness conversation the day I was writing this exhort, and the conversation was with Cynthia Gillis. And she told a story of how on Christmas Eve in 1974, Cyclone Tracy devastated Darwin, killing 66 people. And she mentioned that one of the reasons that it had such a horrific effect was because people didn't heed the warnings provided. And the reason they didn't heed the warnings provided was because a month earlier, the prediction that Cyclone Salma was going to hit Darwin didn't actually eventuate. And so the reliability of the predictions was put into question by the residents of Darwin, and therefore the trust in these predictions was low, and so the people didn't act. And in Daniel, we have a number of examples of the reliability of God, don't we? However, one example that sticks out for me through the events of Daniel's life is the events of chapter 1, where Daniel and his 3 friends asked for vegetables and water instead of the king's food and wine. And just take a moment to consider the context of this request. So firstly, remember the Babylonians, they invaded. And these young men, they were not killed, were they? No doubt like many other young men who probably were killed. Instead, these young men were saved and they were taken back to Babylon. But instead of being made slaves, they were chosen to be educated and fed and watered by the king. After all of this mercy by the Babylonians, once they arrived in Babylon, on their first day of their new job, they request for different food for religious reasons. You can consider this, from the point of view of Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, or from the guards' point of view. These young men have been graciously saved in the invasion and are now being graciously fed and watered and educated by the king, yet they are now refusing the food that's being offered. Someone else in Ashpenaz's position, upon hearing this request, might have decided these young men aren't actually fit for the position being offered, and may have decided to send them off to be slaves or to be something else. Daniel may have thought a reaction like this could have been possible. He may have been thinking that he might be pushing his luck. But I don't think he was thinking these things, though. What I believe that he was thinking is that he can trust in God to guide him through the situation that they face, and that this somewhat small matter of food in the Babylonians' eyes is actually a matter in God's eyes that he's willing to help out with, because he is a reliable God, even looking out for the small things. And notice how the situation unfolds. Notice in verse 9 it says that God gave Daniel favour and compassion in the sight of Ashpenaz. And as per verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, they were better than all the youths who ate the king's food. When considering the reliability of God, the words of Moses come to mind when he was speaking to the people of Israel before they enter the land. The record of this is in Deuteronomy 31, verse 6, and it reads, "Be strong and take heart, and have no fear of them, for it is the Lord your God who is going with you. He will not leave you or forsake you." And those Hebrew words, leave and forsake, they're different words, but they both have the idea of to loosen or to go slack. And these words, loosen and slack, at least for me, they spring images of abseiling to mind. There's nothing like putting your feet on the edge of a cliff and slowly leaning backward, feeling the strength of the rope supporting you as you bring yourself to 90 degrees so you can walk down the cliff. It truly is trusting that rope with your life. If that rope were to loosen or to go slack, you know that you're in trouble. You are trusting the rope that supporting you will stay tight and taut and strong as you descend. So Moses is saying that God is that taut, strong, reliable rope that will be with Israel as they enter the land. And it's a rope that will not loosen or slacken, smashing them against the cliff. It's a rope that will stay taut and strong for them. And this is the same for us, isn't it? God is our taut, strong, reliable rope that will support us as we travel through life. The second factor of the trust equation is capability. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines capability as the ability to do something. And thinking about this in the context of trust, using our abseiling analogy, there may always be a rope available to support us to go down the cliff. The rope may be 100% reliable in terms of it being there. However, our faith in getting to the bottom of the cliff safely also depends on the capability of the rope? Is it long enough to reach the bottom of the cliff? Is it rated sufficiently to support our weight? Is it torn or frayed? Something or someone may reliably turn up or be available exactly according to when we need them, but if they're not capable of fulfilling our need, then we obviously cannot trust the thing or person to fulfill the need. So again, in the book of Daniel, we have many excellent examples of the capability of God displayed. And the one that really sticks out for me is in chapter 3, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the furnace. And in verse 15, after the friends refuse to bow down to the image, we have this amazing challenge from Nebuchadnezzar. And he says there in verse 15, "And who is this God who will deliver you out of my hands?" And I find it interesting because, just back in chapter 2, Daniel revealed to Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation of his dream. And Daniel tells the king in verse 28 of chapter 2 that there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Also, after the interpretation of the dream is given, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges this God as the God of gods. So during this interaction, Daniel also makes a request of the king and to appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province. And so from this interaction on the previous chapter, in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges God as the God of gods, and he understands the friendship between Daniel and the three friends. However, despite this, he either doesn't appear to link the God of gods with the three friends, or he does, but he doesn't believe that this God of God is capable of doing something as magnificent, something as incredible as saving someone from fire. I find it quite amazing. Jumping back to Daniel chapter 3, the friends' response to Nebuchadnezzar show their complete trust in God's ability to save them. And in verse 17 it says, "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand." The three friends state that God is able. They state that God does have the capability to deliver them. The faith and the trust that these three friends display is amazing, isn't it? Fire, it's so physical, it's so real, and for some ancient people, it's even viewed as mystical. Yet these three friends knew that God absolutely has the capability to save them from this element. And when thinking about capability of God, verses like Isaiah 59 verse 1 and Psalm 27 verse 1 come to mind. Isaiah reads, "Surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear." And Psalm reads, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" God is capable of helping in all situations, isn't he? His power is infinite. He created the earth and therefore has the capability to help in all things according to his will. And so then the final factor of the trust equation, is intimacy. In Cambridge Dictionary, again, it defines intimacy as a situation in which you have a close friendship with someone, or things that are said or done only by people who have a close friendship with each other. And you can see the common themes of these two definitions. Intimacy is all about having a close friendship. When you're close to your friends, when you're close with someone that you obviously know a lot about each other. You communicate a lot. You have common interests. And so coming back to our abseiling analogy, there might be a solid, reliable supply of rope. You might also be 100% sure it's capable of holding your weight. But if you do not know how to use the equipment, if you do not have an intimate knowledge of abseiling, the trust you have in getting to the bottom of the cliff is not as strong. Again, coming back to Daniel, there are a number of examples that really stick out. And one that's really obvious is the relationship between the three friends, but one that I want to briefly consider this morning is actually the relationship between Daniel and God. And we find this example over in chapter 6 of Daniel. As we mentioned before, friendships are built on communication. Trust is built on communication. And additionally, I think it's fair to say that relationships really do thrive and grow in times of trouble. And here in chapter 6, Daniel is experiencing time of trouble, isn't he? The king, King Darius, had made a law that you could not pray to any god or make a request of any man for 30 days. And can you imagine how Daniel would have felt hearing this law being read out? Can you imagine not communicating with your best friend or spouse for a whole month? It would be hard, wouldn't it? We obviously are blessed today in our modern time that we can very easily communicate with anyone at any point of time. In many ways, this ease of communication has actually probably reduced our ability to effectively communicate, as well as reduce our appreciation of communication. Back in our chapter here, in this time of trouble, Daniel shows how close his relationship to God is. In verse 10 it says, "Now when Daniel knew that the law was signed, he went to his house where he had windows open to Jerusalem, and he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously." No man-made law was going to change Daniel's relationship with God. Daniel continued to pray 3 times a day with his window open towards Jerusalem, just as he had done previously. And it's interesting, we mustn't forget that Daniel could have actually maybe changed the location or the way that he prayed to ensure that he didn't get caught. For example, he could have maybe closed the windows or prayed in the middle of night under the cover of darkness. Or he could have prayed standing up, saying a prayer in his head so it didn't, look like he was praying. There are many things that Daniel could have done, but Daniel chose not to do these things because, as we said, no man-made law, despite the consequences, was going to change the relationship Daniel had with his God. And that is how strong Daniel's relationship was with God. Daniel had a strong, intimate relationship with God built on communication. And this is why Daniel had such a strong faith, a strong trust in God. So we've considered thus far the 3 factors of trust: reliability, capability, and intimacy. And these 3 factors increase the trust of a relationship. When considering our trust in God and his word, we know that God is 100% reliable, don't we? We can consider the words of 1 John 5, verse 14. And this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. If we ask anything according to God's will, he is going to hear us. That is 100% reliability. Isaiah 40 verse 8 is another quote that comes to mind. "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God will stand forever." God's word, the Bible, will stand forever. It has been preserved through time and will continue to be so. And we must ask ourselves, though, how reliable are we to those who trust us? When considering our trust in God and his word, we know that God is 100% capable, don't we? In fact, do you know why we know this? Not just because we can read the scripture to see the amazing miraculous acts of God, but Paul in his letter to the Ephesians actually states bluntly that God can do things exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. The verse is chapter 3, verse 20. And it says, "Now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us." Isn't that amazing, that verse about the capability of God? God can do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or even think. And so we must ask ourselves, how capable are we to those who trust in us? And when considering our trust in God and his word, we know that God knows us intimately, don't we? He knows us 100%. Luke 12 verse 7 says, or Jesus says that God even knows the number of hairs on our head. And David writes in Psalm 139 of God's intimate knowledge of his people. He says, "O Lord, you have searched and known me. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me." God knows us intimately, but we must ask ourselves, how well do we know God and his word? And how well do we know our brothers, sisters, friends and family who are putting their trust in us? So God's reliability, God's capability and God's knowledge of us is 100%. So our trust equation is looking pretty good so far. But this brings us to the last part of our trust equation, self-interest. Unlike reliability, capability and intimacy, self-interest isn't a factor of trust. It isn't something that's going to multiply or increase trust in a relationship. Instead, it's something that will diminish trust. And so we divide our factors by self-interest. This means that a high self-interest will produce a low trust. And this really makes sense when you think about it. To trust someone, you have to be able to humble yourself to a level which allows you to put your trust in someone else and therefore rely on them instead of yourself. And you can see the opposite of this also in a scenario where someone is so self-interested, someone is so selfish and proud that they refuse to ask or to accept assistance when it's clear that they need it. And when considering Daniel and his 3 friends, it's evident from the record that all 4 of them had a very low self-interest. They refused the king's food, which was no doubt really yummy. They refused to bow down to the image. They willingly went into the fiery furnace. Daniel continued praying to God when it was outlawed and was willing to be thrown into the lions. All of these actions show that Daniel and his 3 friends had an extremely low self-interest. In the book of Daniel, though, we actually have a great example of someone who had a high self-interest, who had to be taught to be humble. And this character is, of course, King Nebuchadnezzar. The king had seen some amazing acts of God. He had had his dreams interpreted. He had seen men alive, standing in fire, unharmed. Yet despite all of this, despite seeing the reliability of God's power, the capability of God's power, and the strong relationship God had with his servants, he, the king, could not trust in God himself because his pride was so great. It diminished these things to naught. But this was all about to change in chapter 4 and verse 30. The king is on his roof in Babylon boasting of his achievements. He says, "Is this not great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty?" While the king was still speaking, God interrupts. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." And so to humble the king, God brings him right down to earth, quite literally. The king no longer had a palace. He no longer had a chef. He no longer had a comfy bed and shelter from the weather. All he had was hair as long as eagle feathers and nails like birds' claws and grass to eat. He was left with nothing but only God to think about. And reading this actually reminded me of Nathan's talks at Combine Weekend, you see. Here we have a king, the king of Babylon, who went from having a fast life as the king to a slow life, among beasts of the fields, from having a fickle life in modern Babylon to living as a wild beast where nothing changes, and went from having a full, rich life in the palace to a simple life eating grass. God used his mighty power to send Nebuchadnezzar into the fields with the cattle to bring about the circumstances required to humble this great king so that he would reach out and recognize the actual ruler, the God of this earth. And as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 1 verse 9, in this context he's speaking about the trouble he had in Asia, but he wrote, "Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Nebuchadnezzar in the field with the wild animals probably felt like he'd received the sentence of death." But Paul goes on, "But that was to make us trust not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we trust that he will yet deliver us." God brought this trial on Nebuchadnezzar so that the king would be humbled and trust in God instead of himself. And God uses trials in our life to teach the same lesson, doesn't he? And it worked for the king, didn't it? The concluding verse of this chapter says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, extol and honour the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways of judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase." And in the chapter that we read this morning, Daniel actually alludes to these events when speaking to Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, who was on the throne. And this provides us with a perfect contrast, a contrast of two kings, one who chose to be humble and one who chose not to be. And speaking of these events to Belshazzar in verse 22, he says, "And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you know all these events, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven." Belshazzar chose not to be humble. He instead chose to be proud, to be self-interested, and therefore there was no place in his heart for trusting God. And we know the result of this, the death of Belshazzar and the passing of the Babylonian kingdom. And so we too must ensure that we are humble in order that our trust in God be not diminished to naught. We must not have a high self-interest, but instead we should be selfless. We must focus our attention on assisting others and doing the work of our Father in heaven. As Philippians 2 verse 4 says, "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." So as we come to remember Christ this morning, we can reflect on the trust that he had for his Father, which surely assisted him through his life. Christ knew wholeheartedly that his Father was reliable, ready to help him at any time, even in the dead of night, in a boat, on a lake, in a storm. Christ knew wholeheartedly that his Father was capable in all things, with the strength to aid him at any time. He knew he could call down a legion of angels with nothing but a prayer. In addition to this, Christ and God had a true intimate relationship, closer than any father and son. From a young age, he was going about his Father's business, and some nights he spent only in prayer. And finally, Christ and God were both completely selfless, weren't they? God was willing to sacrifice his only Son, and Jesus was willing to sacrifice himself for people, for humans who were not even born yet. The equation calculating the trust between God and Jesus would have been 100%. They had complete and utter trust in each other. So as we ponder this and as we go about our week, let us consider our trust equation. What parts can we work on so that we continue to grow in trust and faith as an ecclesia walking towards the coming of our Lord? As Proverbs 3 verse 5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall make your path straight.